At 83, Paul McCartney stands as the last living icon of a musical era the world thought was gone forever. He is the songwriter behind the melodies that changed history, from Yesterday, the most covered ballad of all time, to Hey Jude, the anthem that has healed millions of hearts. From the global explosion of the Beatles, the most influential band of the 20th century, to rising again with Wings, and then building a monumental solo career that has now spanned more than 6 decades, Paul has done what almost no artist in history has managed. He both defined pop culture and outlived every brutal turn of it. He has won 18 Grammys, been knighted by the Queen, been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame twice, and written hundreds of songs that have become part of humanity's shared heritage. And more important than any trophy, he became the voice of an entire generation, a cultural fingerprint the whole world recognizes from just a few notes. But behind that light lies a darkness not everyone has the courage to face. Paul is the last surviving member of the Beatles' Fab Four, the one who has had to carry the memories of his closest friends who left him forever, one by one. John, shot dead just when the future still stretched wide open; George, taken after years of fighting illness; and long before that, when he was only a 14-year-old boy, his mother, the gentle woman who always encouraged him to play music, was taken by cancer, leaving a hole nothing could ever fill. That pain stayed with him for life, always there behind every tender melody he ever wrote. Then came Linda, the love of his life, who pulled him out of depression after the Beatles broke up, only to be stolen by the same cruel disease, forcing him once again to stare down the brutality of fate. At an age when most people finally get to rest, Paul still endures long sleepless nights because of an aching old back, an irregular heartbeat, and ears that once heard the whole world, but now hear it fading. He carries losses no one should have to imagine, the full weight of history, and the loneliness of being the very last person still holding the memories of the brightest chapter in human music. Yet the next morning, when the sun comes up, he still gets out of bed, picks up his guitar the way he has for over 60 years, and keeps walking forward. That is not just the strength of a great artist, it is the will of a man who learned to turn pain into the most beautiful thing he has to offer. And then a quiet question rises like a sigh. How can one human being carry almost a century of grief on his shoulders, and still keep going? If you want to continue this tear-soaked yet deeply resilient journey of Paul McCartney, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. Paul has often said there are moments in life that never fade, no matter how many years pass. For him, that moment came on a cold, late afternoon in 1956, when the hospital corridor reeked of antiseptic and the doctor's footsteps sounded like hammer blows against the heart of a terrified 14-year-old boy. Paul stood pressed against the wall, hands clenched so tight his knuckles went white. No one said anything to him, but the silence of the adults spoke louder than any words. He didn't fully understand what was happening. No one had the courage to explain. But the second the ward door opened and he saw the doctor's grave face, he knew his world had just shattered into pieces. His mother, Mary McCartney, the gentle woman who came home smelling of soap and the warmth of the hospital where she worked, the one who used to put a hand on his shoulder and say, "Just keep playing, Paul," was gone forever. No goodbye, no last hug, only an icy emptiness. His father, Jim, stood frozen for a few seconds as if his soul seemed to leave his body. He was a strong man who rarely showed emotion, but right then his eyes were red, and his shoulders shook. He turned away quickly so his 2 boys wouldn't see him collapse. But Paul saw everything, the bottomless pain of a man who had lost his partner, his anchor, the light of his family. And when they left the hospital that foggy evening, no one spoke. Liverpool felt colder than ever. The walk home felt endless. The yellow streetlights glowing through windows no longer felt warm. Inside the little house, everything looked the same, but the air had changed. It was so heavy, almost impossible to breathe. Paul sat on the stairs staring into nothing, arms hanging limp, feeling like he had just lost the most important thing he would ever have. That night he heard his father cry for the first time, choked, broken, weak sobs, like a man biting down hard to hold on to whatever was left of himself. In that darkness, Paul understood he had to grow up faster than he wanted. There would be no one left to ask, Am I doing okay? No one to ruffle his hair, no one to look at him with pride or worry. He became a boy who learned to hide his tears, because he knew his father couldn't bear one more ounce of sadness. And strangely, in the middle of that pain, music appeared like a small life raft in the night. Paul started picking up the guitar more, not to perform, but to talk to himself. The notes were sad, trembling, but so honest that he felt his mother was somewhere listening. The pain of losing her, a tragedy that should have been just a childhood wound, turned out to be the root wound that shaped the rest of his life. It is why he writes melodies that are gentle yet aching. It is the source of the strange sensitivity in his soul, and it is exactly that wound that made him the artist who could take the world's pain and turn it into songs that have fed millions of hearts. Years later, when he wrote Let It Be, he said the image of Mother Mary came to him in a dream, put her hand on his shoulder and whispered, "Let it be." It wasn't just a lyric, it was the voice of his lost mother coming back to comfort the torn-apart boy he once was. Yet even when that song brought peace to the world, Paul himself still carried a hole that would never close, and from that moment on, his life was no longer a quest for fame, it became a search for light inside a heart that had once fallen into the abyss. But the tragedy of losing his mother was only the opening chapter of a youth full of scars. After the funeral, life for the McCartney family didn't get easier. It got harsher. Post-war Liverpool was still a mess, like a body that hadn't healed from a long illness. Their house, peeling walls, leaking roof whenever it rained heavily, cold wind whistling through cracked windows, was more temporary shelter than home. Everything was scarce: money, warmth, hope, and it was in that weary poverty that Paul and his new friend John Lennon, another boy who had lost his mother too soon, clung to music like it was the last rope keeping them from falling. Yet no one, not neighbors, not teachers, believed that a couple of scruffy kids with cheap wooden guitars yelling in a tiny room could ever amount to anything. They were seen as idle troublemakers who wouldn't focus on anything worthwhile. Paul later recalled that the adults' looks felt like doors slamming in his face: no trust, no hope, no understanding. But that rejection was only the beginning of a much harsher journey. In 1960, when their first real chance appeared, Paul, John, George, and the early Beatles were shipped off to Hamburg, the place known as the Steel Forge for anyone serious about music. But Hamburg was nothing like they imagined. It was a gray, filthy, noisy city, full of cigarette smoke and sleepless streets, where music wasn't listened to, it was consumed like cheap goods. They slept in an old rundown cinema with rotting seats, moldy carpets, and rats running across the floor. By day they wandered looking for cheap food, usually cold noodles or stale bread. By night they had to play 8 straight hours for drunk, rowdy, sometimes violent audiences. People threw bottles, shouted insults, demanded songs the band didn't even know. Night after night they dragged themselves back to their tiny attic soaked in sweat, fingers raw from playing too long, eyes blurred from exhaustion. Some nights Paul fell asleep the second he sat down, still in playing posture, head resting on the guitar, body completely spent. Even sleep wasn't peaceful: constant noise from below, footsteps, shouting, music from the bar next door, everything mixed into a chaotic roar that made their hearts feel even more battered. Some nights the club owner insulted them, threatened to fire them, or paid less than agreed. Once the Hamburg police even deported them for trivial reasons, leaving them not knowing where their next meal or bed would come from. Paul later admitted in a rare interview about that time, "I thought we were going to die there. Not physically, but spiritually, die of despair, because no one believed in them, because they were so exhausted they couldn't tell day from night anymore." And that is exactly what makes their later success so meaningful. The Beatles weren't born in glory. They were born in dark rooms amid the shouts of drunks, in hunger and endless nights when no one knew their names. In that misery Paul learned something he would never forget: if music couldn't save them, nothing would. And it was in Hamburg, the cruelest stage they would ever play, that Paul's artistic soul was forged with sweat, tears, and fears he never dared speak aloud. Yet he kept standing. Exhausted, looked down on, forced into performances that felt like torture, he still held that guitar tight, as if it were the only shield he had against a world too harsh for young hearts. Few people know that before he became a legend, Paul McCartney spent months so dark that even hope felt like a luxury. But it was in the darkest place that he learned the lesson life would keep teaching him: sometimes to survive, you have to keep singing even when you have no breath left. Hamburg forged them, but it was when they returned to England that Paul and his friends entered a phase no one could have imagined, the explosion known as Beatlemania. From boys sleeping in rotting cinemas, they became faces the whole world fought to glimpse for even a second. But the brighter the spotlight, the darker the shadow behind them. At first fame arrived like a flood, reporters shoving to catch them, stepping into a car, girls screaming until they fainted, thousands crowding outside hotels just to see them through a window. Every stage they touched turned into a storm of sound. But those screams that the world saw as pure love, to Paul sometimes felt like suffocation, as if there wasn't enough air left to breathe. In diaries and later interviews, he said there were nights he felt like an exhibit animal locked in a glass cage. People loved the Beatles, but no one actually wanted to understand them. The crowd didn't care how tired, how scared, how much they needed quiet. They just wanted more and more. And in that madness the band started losing the most precious thing: a private life. They couldn't go out to eat without being chased, couldn't relax in a hotel without screams outside, couldn't have a normal conversation without being recorded, photographed, twisted. Even picking up the guitar stopped being joy and became duty. Day after day that pressure crushed their souls. Yet Paul kept trying to hold the group together, and when he says hold together, he doesn't mean just the music, but the spirits of four young men breaking apart under the world's weight. Then in 1967, the first disaster struck. Brian Epstein, their manager and spiritual father, died of an overdose. To outsiders he was just the manager. To the Beatles, especially Paul, Brian was the man who saw their worth when they were still poor kids playing dive bars. He turned them into what the world knows. He was the thread that kept four strong personalities tied together. And when Brian died, the band fell into a void no one could fill. Paul felt thrown into the eye of the storm, with no shelter. There was no longer anyone to mediate conflicts, egos, diverging directions. Brian's absence became a slow-burning crack running through the Beatles' core, growing with every month, every album. But instead of collapsing, Paul did something many people never understood. He tried to step into Brian's role, keep the band running, keep the Beatles from falling into chaos. And that is what turned him into the guy carrying the whole world. The truth is, not everyone wanted to be saved that way. John, deep in his own inner struggles and huge personal changes, felt Paul was controlling too much. George, already feeling overshadowed by Lennon-McCartney, felt disrespected and unheard. Ringo, the gentlest one, felt trapped in tensions he never asked for. And Paul, who only wanted the band to survive, became seen as the bully, the control freak, the guy desperate to keep the Beatles alive at any cost. No one saw how exhausted he was at night. The pressure to write, album after album, had to top the last. The pressure to keep peace, stop John and him drifting further, soothe George's growing resentment, keep the Beatles from imploding under the very fame they once dreamed of. The pressure from himself, nights staring in the mirror not knowing who he was anymore. Friend or boss, artist or icon, man or brand. The world demanded be perfect every second. And in that chaos the most painful question sometimes cut through his mind like a cold blade. Am I still myself? Beatlemania is remembered as the most beautiful era of modern music, but for the people living inside it, it was also a dazzling prison, where every private feeling was crushed into sensational headlines, where real pain had to hide behind smiles, and where the last freedom they lost wasn't the ability to walk outside, but the right to be weak. The peak of fame for Paul was never a place to stay. It was only a place to pass through, beautiful like magic, but closing behind him like a jail door. And when the spotlight burned brightest, that was when the darkness in his soul started spreading fastest. The chaos, after Brian Epstein's death, was only the prelude to the greatest tragedy Paul McCartney ever faced: the breakup of the Beatles. In 1970, when years of built-up tensions between the members could no longer be saved, everything collapsed, and with it an entire era. The world reeled, fans cried, headlines screamed as if civilization had lost part of its soul. But in the center of that storm, only one person was dragged out as the scapegoat. People didn't blame fate, didn't blame circumstances, didn't blame the cracks that had been there for years. They put all the blame on the shoulders of the one man who had tried hardest to keep the band alive in its final months. He was called the traitor, the destroyer of the Beatles, the selfish one. Fans sent hate letters cursing him. The press dissected every word, every move, turning him into the villain who killed a legend. People threw bottles at his car. Some blocked his door just to scream in his face, "Why did you destroy everything?" No one knew that Paul was the one who hurt the most when the Beatles ended. No one wanted to hear that he only filed the lawsuit to dissolve Apple Corps, the only way to protect the music, the money, and the rights of all four members from untrustworthy managers. To the media he was the band's betrayer. To the authorities he was a troublemaker. To the fans he was the man who murdered a shared dream. And to Paul, he was a shattered heart with no way out. That pressure pushed him into a darkness so deep he didn't recognize himself anymore. He drank more, sometimes from morning to night. He couldn't sleep, was consumed by anxiety and fear, avoided all conversation. Linda, his ever-gentle wife, often didn't know what to do except sit beside him, hold his hand and wait for the crisis to pass. Paul stopped writing songs, stopped practicing, stopped singing. The door to the home studio stayed closed, like an admission that music, the thing that had saved him from every previous pain, could no longer reach him. Finally he chose escape. Paul took Linda and little Heather to their farm in Scotland, far from all the noise. There were no fans, no press, no music, just cold wind over the hills, and a silence that choked. It was during this period that Paul said the sentence that would later become his most haunting confession: "I almost died inside." Day after day he sat for hours staring at empty fields where sheep appeared, and then vanished behind the hills like passing time. Some mornings he literally couldn't get out of bed, because the sadness paralyzed his body. Meals passed in silence. No one dared ask if he was okay. Linda sometimes saw him on the porch from before sunrise and still there after dark without moving. He didn't touch the guitar, didn't write a single line, sometimes didn't speak for hours, sometimes whole days. Even surrounded by beautiful nature, Paul felt himself slowly sinking to the bottom of a frozen lake. Every day was a new version of spiritual paralysis. Every night a wrestling match between memories and pain. And the worst pain wasn't the world turning its back. It was the feeling he had lost his closest friends, the ones who had stood with him through poverty, and together wrote songs that made history. Now each had drifted away, and Paul was left alone in his own life. Sometimes even Linda didn't recognize the silent man in front of her as the bright-eyed boy who once wrote "I want to hold your hand," full of faith in the future. There were moments, Paul admitted, he felt his life had ended when the Beatles ended. Not his career, but him, the real him. That collapse didn't just take the band, it took his very sense of self. Every morning was a small battle to find a reason to get up. Every night a bigger battle not to give up. The outside world still saw him as strong, rich, successful. But in Scotland, Paul was just a broken man trying to glue the pieces of himself back together. And perhaps it was in those darkest days that he understood most deeply that legends aren't born in light, they are forged in darkness, where a person must face pain in its rawest form, so that one day they can stand up and sing again. It was in the pitch-black darkness of the post-Beatles years, when Paul McCartney felt he had completely lost both his identity and any reason to live, that the one single thread still tying him to this world was Linda's love. Not the spotlight, not fame, not the fat record deals waiting outside. It was Linda, with a gentleness and patience few people possess, who quietly gathered every shattered piece of Paul's spirit and put them back where they belonged. When Paul drowned himself in alcohol, Linda never left him. When Paul lost faith in music, Linda told him to play it note by note again, even if only in their tiny kitchen. When Paul said, "I'm nobody anymore," Linda answered, "You're still the man I love." Sometimes that alone is enough to make a person want to live again. And then from the frozen Scottish soil, where Paul once believed he had hit rock bottom, a new sprout of life began to break through. No more Beatles, no more expectations from the world. Just a man, a woman, their children, and music, the kind of music he had to learn to love again, little by little. Wings, Paul's new band, wasn't born out of ambition. It was born out of the need to survive, the need to create, to breathe, to be himself, without carrying the gigantic shadow of the Beatles. They started over from zero. No massive stadiums, no state-of-the-art sound systems, no army of hundreds of crew members. Paul, Linda, and the members of Wings toured in an old van, loaded their own gear, set up their own stage, and packed everything up again after every show. They slept in cheap motels, ate simple meals, and played for audiences who often had no idea who they were. Many nights Paul sat shivering in the back of the van, arms wrapped around Linda for warmth, and smiled faintly. "We really are starting from scratch, aren't we?" Linda replied, "From scratch or from the middle, doesn't matter, as long as we're together." But the outside world wasn't as gentle as Linda. Critics attacked Paul mercilessly. Headlines screamed, "Paul McCartney died with the Beatles. Wings is just a pale shadow of the past. Without the Beatles, McCartney is nothing." They mocked the way Linda played keyboards, called her unprofessional, dug into their private life, and relentlessly compared every new song Paul wrote to the old masterpieces, as if he were cursed to spend his life trying to outdo himself forever. What made Paul different was that he refused to surrender. He knew that to escape the Beatles' shadow he had to walk through it, not crush it, not avoid it, but let it follow behind him, like a beautiful memory that no longer chained him. And to do that he needed one thing only: faith. Faith in music, faith in himself, and faith in the love Linda had for him. When they began work on the album Band on the Run, everything went against them once more. Two Wings members quit right before the trip to Nigeria. The studio was like an oven, and full of mosquitoes. The master tapes were stolen. Equipment kept breaking down. Most artists would have taken that as a sign to stop. But Paul, for the first time in years, fought back. He fought exhaustion, the Beatles' shadow, public ridicule, and the desperate man inside himself. Linda, as always, stood beside him. She didn't need to say much. Just being there was enough for Paul to know he wasn't fighting alone. And then Band on the Run was born, not as an ordinary album, but as a declaration that Paul McCartney was still alive, still creating, still had a heart to give to music. The album instantly became a masterpiece, praised by critics, loved by fans, and turned Wings from a ridiculed band into one of the most successful acts of the 1970s. But the most important thing to Paul wasn't the commercial success. What brought tears to his eyes when he looked back on that journey was that the album had been made in the days when he thought he had nothing left, except Linda. Linda's love didn't just save Paul from collapse, it reborn him. It made him believe life still held beauty ahead, that music could still heal, that he wasn't doomed to be the misunderstood guilty man forever. Linda saw what the whole world at that time refused to see: Paul McCartney had never died, only the hope inside him had been buried deep beneath the pain. And Linda gently dug through every layer of that soil, day by day, until Paul found himself again. That love, quiet, unglamorous, unshowy, was what saved one of the greatest souls in music from being destroyed by the darkness inside his own heart. And from the ashes of those painful years, Paul rose once more, not as a former Beatle clinging to the past, but as a man who understood that life truly begins when you meet someone willing to love even your most broken parts. Linda was that person. The years with Wings and with Linda helped Paul rise from his own ashes, but life, cruel as ever, sometimes refuses to let anyone heal completely. And on a winter evening in 1980, it delivered the hardest blow Paul's heart had taken since the day his mother died. That night Paul was in a London studio, halfway through mixing a track, when the phone rang. The moment he heard the voice on the other end, his heart clenched, not from the words, but from the long silence before the horrific news finally came: "John has been shot." Paul froze. The room seemed to collapse around him. All sound vanished. He doesn't remember putting the phone down or whether it fell from his hand. He only remembers his knees buckling and his mind going completely blank, as if someone had hollowed it out. The next words, that John didn't make it, were like a second bullet through his heart. Then, a third. Then a fourth. Every syllable sliced into his soul. John Lennon wasn't just a bandmate, not just a songwriting partner. Not just the guy who used to make him laugh until his stomach hurt in their teenage years. John was part of Paul's soul, the only person on earth who truly understood what it was like to be a Beatle, the one who had lived through poverty, awful stages, Beatlemania and the wildest years of their lives with him. And now, in a single instant, it was all gone, stolen by a senseless, meaningless, brutal bullets. Paul didn't cry right away. He later said the pain was too thick for tears. It was hot, searing, like someone twisting his heart with bare hands. When he finally spoke, only one trembling, choked sentence came out. "I can't take it." Linda held him, but no words could soothe it. The next day, when reporters asked how he felt, Paul, exhausted and empty of words, said only, "It's a drag." The whole world criticized that answer, thinking he was indifferent. But no one knew that behind the calm face was a man who had just lost half his heart ripped out. No one knew he cried in the car on the way home. No one knew he sat motionless on the sofa until morning, staring into space, repeating over and over, "It can't be. It can't be." But perhaps what made Paul's pain even crueler was the guilt. In the final Beatles years, the relationship between Paul and John had fractured badly. They avoided each other, argued, competed, even said things that hurt both of them. And although things had slowly warmed again later, although they still wrote letters, talked on the phone, although John once said he still loved Paul like the old days, Paul always felt they never fully mended it. They still had unfinished conversations, unfinished songs, unfinished forgiveness, an unfinished friendship they had built as scruffy Liverpool teenagers clutching guitars. When John died, Paul didn't just lose the best friend of his life, he lost the chance to say he had always loved John, that all the arguments were just shadows cast by pressure, that the Beatles could never have existed without John Lennon. He lost the chance to apologize, and to hear John apologize. That pain burrowed deep year after year, decade after decade. In an interview many years later, Paul broke down crying when he said, "If only I had visited John more. If only I had told him everything that was in my heart. If only we'd had more time." But they didn't have more time. One bullet took it all away. And for Paul it wasn't just the death of John Lennon. It was the death of part of his youth, part of his soul, and part of himself. There are nights Paul still wakes up dreaming. He sees John smiling in Hamburg or singing in the Abbey Road studio. He says sometimes he still hears John's voice in his head when he writes, as if John is standing right there, suggesting a lyric or a chord. The most painful thing is this: the world lost John Lennon, but Paul lost John, the friend no one else could ever replace. When people ask how long it took him to get over John's death, Paul answers without hesitation, "I never got over it." And the truth is, he doesn't have to. A friendship like that, a bond like that, doesn't need to be gotten over. It only needs to be carried, for the rest of your life. John is the chapter in Paul's life that will never close, the wound that will never heal, the pain that will never fade, and the love that will never die. John's death left a wound Paul would carry forever, but life never pauses long enough for anyone to fully heal. That wound had barely scarred when another was already waiting. Actually, it had come earlier, in 1976, but Paul wouldn't truly face it until decades later, the death of his father, Jim McCartney. When Jim died, Paul was at the peak of Wings' success, packed schedules, huge shows, #1 albums, glowing reviews. Everything kept him from stopping even for a moment to feel the loss. He arranged the funeral, hugged his siblings, said the right words, but his heart never really entered the grieving stage. Paul was too busy to hurt. He put the pain in a box, locked it, and hid it in the darkest corner of his mind. But time has its own way of opening boxes we want buried. In the 1980s and 90s, as youth slipped away, Paul finally felt his father's absence. He remembered evenings when Jim sat in his armchair, eyes half closed, listening to his son mess around on guitar. He remembered the gentle advice, the quiet encouragement from a man who wasn't big on fancy words. When Jim died, Paul realized he had never actually said, "I love you, Dad." And that became one of the deepest regrets of his life. That regret simmered for years, slipping into every quiet moment, every sleepless night, every time he wondered if he could have done anything differently. Paul's youth. full of storms, full of light, but also full of loss, was gradually leaving him behind. And as he entered the 1990s, life tested his endurance once again. Responsibility for a big family, stepchildren, children together, relatives, staff, collaborators, everyone leaned on Paul. The world saw a wealthy legend, but few knew he was holding up an entire network of people who depended on him. On top of that came huge tours, new albums, art projects, company obligations, producers, media, financial pressure from failed investments and mismanagement by some associates forced him to work far beyond what a middle-aged man's body could take. He began to burn out. Endless flights, hotels whose names he couldn't remember, shows where his body ran on adrenaline alone. But at night, when the stage lights went out, the cheers faded, the convoy took him back to the hotel, everything fell into a hollow silence. Paul has said that some nights he stood in front of the hotel mirror, still sweating, and asked himself, "Why do I feel empty in the middle of applause?" It wasn't the emptiness of failure. On the contrary, Paul was more successful than ever, but that success couldn't fill the deep holes inside him, where his father had gone, where John was missing, where youth had grown old, where his family was growing weary of a life that never slowed down. Those nights he paced the room like a lost soul, opening and closing notebooks without writing a single note. Some nights he sat by the window looking down at unfamiliar streets, glowing under yellow lamps, feeling both at the top of the world and at the very bottom at the same time. It was a slow erosion, a silent kind of exhaustion that seeped into his bones. No one saw it except Linda, the only one who realized that behind the smiles on stage was a man fighting disorientation. She gently tried to bring him back to family, to the music he truly loved, to simple moments that still had soul. But life showed no mercy. The years ahead would bring Paul a loss far worse, a pain that even the post-Beatles crisis couldn't compare to, and he would have to face it not only as an artist, but as a man forced for the first time to accept that not every love is strong enough to keep the person you love here. But all the previous losses, his mother, his father, John, his youth, his stability, were mere breezes compared to the cruelest storm of Paul's life, Linda's cancer. If there was anything in this world Paul believed was more enduring than music, it was Linda. She wasn't just his wife, she was the person who pulled him from the abyss after the Beatles, who held his hand through every storm, who made him believe life could still be gentle, despite every loss he had suffered. And that is why Linda's illness was the most vicious thing fate ever inflicted on Paul. Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer in the mid-1990s, but as cancer does, it didn't attack loudly, it crept silently, seeping into every cell, every breath, every moment of peace Paul tried to protect. Paul said the moment the doctor gave the results, it felt like someone reached inside his chest and crushed his heart, not because he feared losing Linda, but because he knew the strongest woman he had ever known was about to face the most painful battle of her life. Paul became Linda's caregiver, not like a rock star legend, but like a father caring for a child, so tender it melted the hearts of everyone who saw. He prepared every meal exactly as the doctors ordered, he checked every pill, he juiced vegetables for her every morning, he walked with her slowly through quiet gardens. Every step she took, he was right there, as if letting go of her hand would make her fall. And of course he never let go. On nights when the pain kept her awake, he sat by the bed holding her hand, stroking the back of it, reading her favorite poems aloud. On mornings she couldn't get out of bed, he carried her like a child, and placed her in the armchair by the window so she could look at the garden she loved. When the pain made her cry from exhaustion, Paul held her against his shoulder, trying not to let her see his own eyes were red too. He wanted to be strong for both of them, but in truth he was terrified. Terrified to look into her eyes and see them growing weaker each day. Terrified of test results. Terrified of every hospital visit. Terrified most of all of the day she would no longer be there for him to love. Linda fought like a warrior. She never complained, never gave up. She kept a gentle smile, even when her hair fell out in clumps, and her body began to betray her. Paul often said Linda's last smile was stronger than any song I ever wrote, but cancer didn't care about smiles. It kept advancing, little by little, stealing her energy, her breath, her walks, her peaceful mornings. Every second Paul tried desperately to hold on to. And then that day came, the day Paul would remember every detail of for the rest of his life. Linda lay in bed, soft sunlight coming through the window. Paul held her, whispering about the Scottish fields they had run through in their poorest but most beautiful years. He told her he loved her. He told her she didn't have to be strong anymore. He told her that if there was another life, he would find her first. And Linda smiled, a very small, very weak smile, but enough to turn his heart to dust. Then she took her last breath, and Paul's world collapsed. No sound, no light, no future, just a bottomless void in his chest where his heart used to be. He held her body for so long, the nurses had to gently remind him they needed to take her away. But Paul didn't want to let go, couldn't let go, didn't know how to live after letting go. In the time that followed, Paul entered one of the darkest periods of his life. He cried every day, many times a day. In a later interview, he admitted, "I cried for a whole year. I couldn't stop. I kept asking, why do the good ones go first?" He saw Linda everywhere, in the kitchen corner where she made salads, in the armchair by the window, in the garden where she photographed the kids. Every song he wrote carried Linda's breath, but also an unhealable pain. The pain of losing his mother, his father John, all of it seemed to gather and replay itself in losing Linda, as if fate were testing the absolute limit of what Paul could endure. But here was the difference. When his mother died, he was a child. When his father died, he was a grown artist. When John died, he was a shattered friend. But when Linda died, he lost half his soul. If life is a long song, Linda was its most beautiful chorus. And when that chorus fell silent, everything else felt empty. Linda didn't just leave. She took the best part of Paul with her, the part that still believed in love. And so this wasn't only the most painful chapter of his story, it was the chapter that defined human fragility, that even legends are not spared the losses that bring them to their knees. Linda's passing left a void in Paul no words can fill. For years he lived as if walking between two worlds, one where people saw him smile, play music, keep being Paul McCartney, and another where he still saw Linda every time he closed his eyes, still heard her laugh in the kitchen, still reached out beside him in the morning, only to touch cold emptiness. But a person cannot live forever in grief. Paul didn't want to replace Linda, he only wanted to live again. And it was during that time that Heather Mills entered his life like a strange breeze, bringing something that felt almost like revival. Heather was strong, independent, full of energy. She had survived a horrific accident that cost her a leg, and that very resilience made Paul feel close to her. He once said Heather reminded him of Linda in one way. She never gave up. Their love came quickly, as if part of Paul was trying to cling to anything that gave him hope again. Their 2002 wedding was called by the press Paul's beautiful new chapter. But life, as Paul had learned too many times, always has its dark side. Heather, for all her admirable qualities, attracted the media in a way Paul, who cherished privacy, could hardly bear. She had been a model, an activist, a celebrity in a way that wasn't quite like Paul's way. The public pressure on that marriage became unbearable. The press called them the mismatched couple, obsessed over the age difference, backgrounds, lifestyles. Heather was attacked, and she attacked back. Paul, caught between love and duty, between hope and confusion, tried to keep everything calm, but the cracks grew like fractures in glass already too thin. And then the marriage fell apart, not with a gentle goodbye, but with one of the ugliest, most public divorces in Britain. The media descended like vultures. They dissected every word Paul said. They tore apart every action of Heather's. They turned every disagreement into all-out war. Worse, the years-long legal battle dragged both of them into a spiral of mutual accusations neither really wanted, but neither could escape. Heather cried on television, accusing Paul. Paul stayed mostly silent, but that silence was interpreted as guilt. The press took sides. Team Paul, Team Heather. Some defended him, some vilified him, some defended her, some mocked her. Both became targets for public rage, speculation, judgment, And in all that chaos, very few people noticed that Paul was once again losing something he had tried to hold on to: faith in love. After losing Linda, Paul didn't need perfect love, he only needed an anchor. Heather for a time had been that anchor, but reality is far more complicated than love stories written in hope. When it was over, Paul said in a rare interview, "I don't understand why life keeps taking away the things I try hardest to keep." That sentence carried no blame toward Heather, it carried the helplessness of a man who had already endured enough loss for one lifetime, yet fate kept testing him. Paul didn't blame, he didn't speak ill, he was simply sad, the bitter sadness of someone who had loved deeply, but couldn't make it whole. The marriage to Heather wasn't a mistake, it was simply a chapter both entered carrying their own wounds, and neither was healed enough to heal the other. For Paul it was a marriage built on hope but torn apart by harsh reality, yet even after the way it ended, he chose to walk away with dignity. No bitterness, no hatred, only deep weariness and regret. He had tried to love again, but sometimes love isn't enough to conquer circumstance. And once again, as he had every other time in his turbulent life, Paul learned to move forward, with grace, with dignity, and with the quiet sadness of a man who has lost more than most people will ever know. Walking out of the stormy marriage with Heather, Paul tried to reclaim the part of his life that felt worn away by loss, pressure, and the relentless media hurricane that never let him go. But once a person survives heartbreak, life reminds them there is a quieter, more relentless enemy: time. And for Paul, time began its strongest attack when he turned 60. If Paul's youth was an explosive, radiant song, his old age is made of slow, thin notes, sometimes trembling. Yet he still sings, still stands on stage, still smiles at tens of thousands of people every night. But behind the lights, behind the cheers, is a body quietly, cruelly declining day by day. Rumors of heart surgery started when Paul reached his 60s. He never publicly revealed the full details of his health. He didn't want fans to worry and didn't want to become a pity story for the press. But those close to him knew his heart had been overworked for decades. Endless tours, sleepless nights, stress, accumulated grief. Everything had left its mark. A minor procedure, the doctors called it, but it was a gentle tap from death reminding him he was no longer the boy leaping around the stage in 1964. Joint pain became Paul's new constant companion. In his younger years he ran, jumped, swung the bass with the energy of a man carrying an entire era inside him. Now just stepping off the tour bus or standing too long on stage, his knees and back now shoot sharp warnings. Once, after a show, he sat motionless in the dressing room for nearly 20 minutes, just waiting for the pain to ease enough to stand. And perhaps the most painful loss for a musician like Paul is this: his voice is slowly fading. The voice that once enchanted the whole world, the voice of Blackbird Let It Be, Maybe I'm Amazed, no longer holds the same clarity and power. High notes have become difficult. Sometimes he has to change the way he sings to spare his vocal cords. And Paul, who once sang as naturally as breathing, now feels fear. What will happen if one day I can't sing anymore? For an ordinary person, that fear is losing a skill. For Paul it is the fear of losing his identity, the last thread tying him to life, the only language he knows to heal himself. It's not just the voice, his hearing has declined too. A lifetime in front of loudspeakers, in studios, on stages has taken its toll. Some days he hears constant ringing. Some days sounds are muffled, as if someone placed a glass wall between him and the world. For someone who has lived by music, that is a form of torture, yet he still tours, still performs, still sees thousands of people crying when he plays the songs they grew up with. But only he knows every show is now a battle. Post-tour exhaustion is no longer just tiredness, it is total depletion. Nights he can't sleep because muscles ache. Mornings he wakes up unable to move quickly. Hours spent in the morning just warming up the body before rehearsal. But Paul never complains. He has lost too many people he loved to forget that being able to stand on stage at all is a gift not everyone gets. Still, there are tragic moments he can't hide. Moments backstage when he leans one hand against the wall and places the other on his chest trying to steady his breathing. Moments he sits silently in a chair, eyes closed, listening to his body protest. Moments he looks in the mirror, sees an old face he barely recognizes, and quietly asks himself, how much longer can I keep doing this? The man who once sang for the whole world now has to fight just to walk on stage. Yet in this very battle with old age, Paul proves once again that his spirit is stronger than his body, stronger than fear, stronger than time. He still stands, still sings, still brings the guitar to his chest in that familiar way millions of people around the world love. Because music is not just something he creates, music is what keeps him tethered to life. And as long as he can open his mouth to sing, even if only with a trembling breath, Paul McCartney will not back down. In the relentless swirl of time and bodily wounds, Paul entered a phase many thought would see him slowly sink into loneliness. After losing Linda and the noisy marriage to Heather, the world assumed he no longer wanted, or no longer had the strength to love again. But then, like a quiet miracle, Nancy Shevell walked into his life, not with noise, not with drama, not carrying storms from the past, but as a soft, small yet steady light. Nancy is not from the entertainment world. She doesn't chase spotlights or care about fame. Coming from a business family, Nancy is someone who has faced her own hardships, including a battle with cancer. She didn't come to Paul as a fan, someone seeking protection, or someone wanting to step into a legend's world. She came as a person who understands what it is to be wounded, what it is to lose, and what it is to keep living even when the heart is no longer whole. Paul has described Nancy as a calm harbor after decades of storms. And that is exactly right. If Linda was a warm, energetic, life-filled flame, Nancy is cool, soothing water, not necessarily warming, but calming the burns life left on Paul. But this love didn't arrive like lightning. It arrived like a cloudy morning with gentle sunlight breaking through, not enough to chase away all darkness, but enough to make a person believe the sky can brighten again. Paul still carries the ghosts of old losses. He still sees Linda in the places she used to sit, still remembers her laugh when he plays her a new song, still feels her hand on his when he's worried. Those things never disappear. And Nancy, instead of trying to erase those memories, quietly accepts them, respects them, walks beside them, as if they are part of Paul she would never ask him to trade away. Healing, for Paul, has never been a smooth process. It doesn't start from a blank page. It starts from pages already torn, ink smudged, scorched from being folded too many times. There are days Nancy simply holds his hand in silence, because she knows he is remembering Linda. There are nights Paul dreams of John, dreams of youth, dreams of Liverpool, and Nancy just gently places a hand on his back to remind him he is still here, still alive. There are quiet afternoons in the house, when Paul picks up the guitar, plays an old melody, and suddenly stops mid-phrase, eyes downcast. Nancy doesn't ask why, because she knows the answer lies deeper than words. Healing is not erasing. Healing is learning to live with the pain. Paul, after all the losses, no longer needed explosive love. He needed love that knows how to listen. Nancy gave him that, and that is what made him love her in a very different way. Not passionately like in his youth, not wildly like with Linda, not trying to fill a void, but a later love, deep and calm. A love that helped him understand that a heart, no matter how many times it has been crushed, can still beat again, not as strongly as before, but truly, steadily, and beautifully. They married in 2011 in a small, warm ceremony. No rock star extravagance, no media circus, just family and close friends, as if Paul wanted to protect this love from the world that had hurt him so many times before. Close friends say that since Nancy came into his life, Paul looks lighter, not younger, not stronger, but lighter, as if he has finally learned how to set down part of the weight he carried for so long. She helped him build healthier habits, work less frantically, know when to rest. She never tried to replace Linda. She simply helped Paul look at life with eyes that hurt a little less. Still, healing doesn't come in a straight line. Some days the old pain returns like a storm. Some moments Paul suddenly goes quiet, watching old Beatles footage, or looking at a photo of Linda on the wall. Nancy is never jealous, never upset. She knows she is loving a man who has lived two lives, one of light, and one of loss, and she accepts both. In the end, what Nancy gave Paul was not complete happiness. Life has taken too much for anyone to give it all back. What she gave him was peace. The kind of peace Paul has craved since he was a 14-year-old boy who lost his mother. Nancy doesn't erase a single scar, she just helps them stop throbbing. And sometimes, as Paul now understands more clearly than ever, that is enough for a heart that has been far too tired to keep beating for many more years. At 83, Paul McCartney has entered a stage of life few can imagine, a place both tender and merciless, where memory and time weave together into threads both heartbreakingly beautiful and unbearably heavy. He still lives, still creates, still smiles, still loves, but every morning when he opens his eyes, he knows he is living in a world where almost everyone he loved most has gone before him. John Lennon is gone, George Harrison is gone, Brian Epstein is gone, Linda is gone, his parents are gone. The souls who once helped him write the most beautiful chapter of modern culture now exist only in his memory, memories Paul himself calls a treasure heavy as stone. He once said a sentence that made listeners choke up: "Everyone I ever loved has gone before me." The loneliness of Paul's old age is not the loneliness of someone with no friends or family. He has family, fans, shows with tens of thousands of people. But the deepest loneliness doesn't come from having no one. It comes from no longer having anyone who remembers the things only he still remembers. No one remembers the smell of Abbey Road Studios in 1964. No one hears George testing a chord before Paul steps to the microphone. No one remembers John's stupid jokes right before they walked out onto the Shea Stadium stage. Those pieces of an era that will never return exist only as film reels in Paul's mind, and he is the last person alive who can still play them. Paul's life at 83 is built on quiet routines, as if trying to keep his body serving a soul that has weathered too many storms. In the morning he rolls out a yoga mat in the living room, movement slow, breathing steady but heavy. Back pain forces him to pause many times, but he persists because it is the only way to keep his body from betraying him. Motions that once came easily are now challenges. But Paul still smiles, a small, slightly tired but peaceful smile. Afterward he makes tea, opens the windows to let light in, then sits at his desk. In front of him is a blank sheet of paper. Many days he just looks at it, doesn't write anything, just looks. The man who once wrote "Hey Jude" in 10 minutes, who wrote "Let It Be" as if someone whispered it in a dream, now sometimes sits for hours with pen in hand, unmoving. Not because he's out of ideas, but because every melody brings up another layer of memory, and those memories are both beautiful and painful. He remembers the first time he played Yesterday, remembers Linda's gentle smile when she heard My Love, remembers John lighting a cigarette while they wrote She Loves You. Every note is a mirror reflecting the souls who went before him, and sometimes it hurts too much to sing. But night is when memories flood back clearest. The house is quiet, wind in the garden, the clock ticking. Paul lies there, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling, and in the space between waking and dreaming he hears John's voice blend with his own. Like 1965, like the cramped studio, like the days when they were just two boys who only knew music. The voice is no longer clear, no longer close, but still enough to make an 83-year-old man's heart tremble. Is there anything more tragic than being the last one left to remember it all? Yet the miracle is this: despite the sorrow that surrounds him, Paul is not despairing. He has survived the Beatles' breakup, the death of his soulmate friend, the loss of his soulmate wife, the loneliness of old age, the decay of his body. He has cried enough tears for many lifetimes, but instead of letting those wounds drag him into the abyss, he chooses to keep singing, not because he thinks he is immortal, not because he wants to prove anything, but because music is the last thread tying him to the people he loved, and to the world itself. Paul doesn't sing to forget, he sings to remember, to keep the Beatles alive one more day, to keep his youth breathing one more breath, to keep those who went before him alive in every note, and to remind the world that no matter how heavy the memories he carries, he keeps walking, slowly, shakily, but resolutely. Paul McCartney at 83 is a monument not only for the music he left behind, but for the way he keeps living while carrying an entire lost era on his shoulders. The last man still standing in a vast field of memories, lonely but never giving up. At 83, looking back on a journey of more than 6 decades, people usually talk about Paul McCartney in numbers: over 60 gold records, hundreds of songs, billions of streams, countless awards, 2 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductions, millions around the world who see him as a living inspiration. But those numbers, dazzling as they are, cannot touch the most important part of Paul's legacy: the human being. Throughout his life, Paul didn't just write songs, he wrote pieces of his heart, fragments of memory, wounds, pains he has lived with since childhood. People call him a songwriting genius, but few notice that every note in his catalog is a conversation with his own losses. When Paul wrote Let It Be, he was searching for his mother in a dream. When he wrote Maybe I'm Amazed, he was thanking Linda for saving him from darkness. When he wrote Blackbird, he was writing about liberation, not just for others, but for himself. When he wrote Here Today, he cried for John, for the friendship forever unfinished and unhealable. And when he stands on stage, sometimes falling silent as tens of thousands sing his words back to him, he understands that his most private pains have left him to become medicine for countless others. Paul uses his pain to help the world hurt a little less. That is the true legacy. Throughout his career, Paul has spoken of love, peace and kindness, not with empty slogans, but with his very life, a life torn into pieces many times yet still pieced back together with kindness. Despite every trial, Paul knows how cruel life can be. He has lived it. He knows what loss is. He has carried it since he was 14. He knows what loneliness is. His old age is living proof. And perhaps that is exactly why Paul's music lives forever. It does not come from technique. It does not come from fame. It comes from a human being, from a heart that has been shattered yet still chooses to love. What makes Paul one of the most influential figures of the 20th century is not just the Beatles' music, or Wings, or his brilliant solo albums. It is the humanity he poured into every melody. Paul's music didn't merely reflect an era, it helped shape it. His songs walked alongside the peace movement, the civil rights struggle, the global youth cultural revolution. It is no accident that millions say Paul's music saved their youth from darkness. And then, when we look at Paul today, silver hair, slightly stooped back, hoarse voice, slower steps, we realize something even deeper. A legacy is not only in the songs you leave behind, but in the person you become after all those losses. Paul is not bitter, not worn out by life, not closed off. On the contrary, he has grown gentler, more compassionate, more empathetic. In many interviews, he pauses for a moment when he mentions his mother John, George, Linda, as if the memory just brushed against a wound that never fully healed. But he doesn't avoid it, he lives with it, accepts it, and turns it into a strange kind of light. The light of a man who has endured great pain yet still chooses to smile. People often say old age brings wisdom, but for Paul old age brings a deeper truth. Old people who carry memories also carry pain no one else can see. Paul carries the memories of the Beatles, the wild nights, the immortal songs, the fiery arguments, the miraculous creative moments. He carries the memories of family, his mother taken too soon, his father gone, Linda fighting cancer, children growing up amid love and sorrow. He carries the memories of friendship, John with his brilliance and chaos, George with his quiet river-like soul, Ringo with his laughter that never ages. All those memories, breathtakingly beautiful yet painful enough to buckle the knees, leave an invisible weight on his shoulders. But those very memories are what made Paul McCartney, a man who knows how to love from wounds, who knows how to create from emptiness, who knows how to rise from losses that seemed impossible to survive. And that is why his legacy is not only heard with the ears, it is felt with the heart. It does not live only in immortal songs, it lives in the way he turned a cracked and fractured life into proof that even when the world takes everything from you, you can still choose to create the most beautiful thing from whatever is left. At 83, Looking back on a life spanning nearly a century, Paul McCartney no longer resembles the mythic image the world once pinned on him. He is not merely the ex-Beatle, not merely the songwriting genius, not merely the greatest musician of the 20th century. All those titles are true, but none are enough to capture the core of this man, a boy who lost his mother too young, walked through darkness to become light for billions of others, and then had to learn to live with a loneliness no one sees at the end of the road. When his mother died at 14, Paul had no idea that grief would be the first material, and the last material, of his music. At 20, the world worshipped the Beatles as young gods, but inside he was still a child, carrying an unhealed memory. At 40 he lost John, his best friend, his soulmate partner, and his soul tore again. At 50 he lost Linda, the love of his life, the woman who saved him from falling apart after the Beatles, and his world truly collapsed. At 60 and 70 his body began to betray him, weaker voice, poorer hearing, tours that left him exhausted for days, yet he kept standing, kept singing, kept living with a gratitude many never find. And when he entered his 80s, he finally heard what life had been whispering for decades, but he had never wanted to listen to. A legacy is not in what you achieve, but in how you live after every time your heart is broken. Paul is living proof of that truth. For American audiences, a country that loves music, loves freedom, loves stories of rising above adversity, Paul's journey offers a simple yet profound lesson. We will all lose the people we love. It may be parents, spouses, best friends, or those who once were our entire world. Paul lost his mother as a teenager, lost Brian Epstein at the height of success, lost John before every wound was healed, lost Linda when he needed her most. Each time he collapsed, not under stage lights, but in dark rooms no one saw. But what makes him an icon is not only his God-given creative gift, but the way he got back up after every loss. He never let pain slam his heart shut. He loved again, wrote again, lived again, even though each time it was harder than the last. We will all grow old and frail. Old age spares no one. It brings aching backs, sore knees, shorter breath, weaker voices, memories that blur together, and long nights when the body refuses to cooperate. But Paul refuses to surrender to age. He does yoga every morning, even if he has to pause because his back hurts. He tours knowing every show will cost him sleepless nights. He records, composes, plays for hours, not to prove he is still young, but to prove his heart has never grown old. We will all have regrets. Every life has its if-onlys. If only I had apologized sooner. If only I had spent more time with the people I love. If only I had been braver, more patient, kinder. Paul has them too. He regrets never getting to say a final goodbye to his mother. He regrets not fully reconciling with John. He regrets not being able to save Linda, though he clung to hope like a drowning man. But regret is not the end. The important thing, the thing Paul teaches us, is to still choose love, still choose to create beauty, still choose to stand up after every blow life delivers too hard. There is one image those close to Paul recount that seems to contain the entire spirit of his life. One afternoon, 83-year-old Paul sits alone in his small studio, sunlight pouring through the window. On his lap is the old acoustic guitar, strings a little worn but still ringing with an impossibly warm tone. He is not writing, not recording, just sitting there, gently picking single notes, hands trembling in a way age can no longer hide. But his eyes, the eyes that have seen glory and hell, that have seen the whole world and lost the whole world, are impossibly warm, as if in that moment, he is singing to everyone who left him, to Mother Mary, who taught him to find strength and gentleness, to Father Jim, who loved him quietly in a way he only understood when he grew up, to John, the soulmate friend no one could ever replace, to George, who carried the soul of a gentle, profound artist, to Linda, who lifted him from ashes and loved him until her final breath. And in the same way he is singing to us, the people walking through our own storms, learning to live with pain, with aging, with if-onlys we can't rewrite. Paul McCartney is not only a legacy of music, he is a legacy of continuing to live, of enduring love, of the ability to rise even when life seems to leave nothing but wounds. And that is what makes his story a lesson not just for the Beatles generation, or the rock and roll generation, or the modern music generation, but for all of us who are trying to reach the end of our lives with our hearts still full of kindness. At 83, Paul McCartney no longer runs, no longer shouts, no longer plays every single night, but he still sings, still strums, still lets music flow through trembling fingers. And in that final image, him sitting alone with the old acoustic guitar, hands shaking but eyes warm, we understand. He is not singing to hold on to the past, he is singing to keep everything beautiful life ever gave him, no matter how cruel it became. And he is singing for us, to remind us that love, loss, and the will to keep going are three things that can never be separated in a human life. Looking back on Paul McCartney's journey in this story, it's almost impossible not to feel a quiet, lingering sadness that stretches from his teenage years all the way to 83. From the 14-year-old boy standing in the hospital corridor, hearing the doctor's footsteps before losing his mother forever, to the young man sleeping on the floor of a rundown cinema in Hamburg, eating cold noodles and playing for drunks, we see clearly that the glory he later earned never fell from the sky. When Beatlemania exploded and the world worshipped them, inside Paul felt like an exhibit animal locked in a beautiful prison of fame. When Brian Epstein died, when the Beatles broke up in 1970 and the world blamed him, when he hid on a Scottish farm staring at empty fields, drinking and saying, "I almost died inside," that wasn't just a star's tragedy, it was the tragedy of any human being stripped of meaning. Then life grew even crueler, losing John to a senseless bullet, losing his father, losing Linda after a brutal cancer fight, being dragged through the noisy marriage to Heather, health failing from 60 to 80, until he alone remained as the last keeper of Beatles memories, sitting at 83, hands trembling yet still cradling the guitar, as if singing to everyone who left him behind. But what makes him worthy of reverence before American audiences is not only the immortal songs, but the way he kept choosing love and creating value even after his heart was broken so many times, rebuilding life with Linda, turning pain into Let It Be and Here Today, accepting Nancy as a peaceful harbor, doing yoga every morning to fight a betraying body, still taking the stage even when it costs him nights of agony. Paul's story reminds every American that we will all lose, we will all age, but the dignity of a life lies in daring to keep singing, in our own way, even when the voice is hoarse, the hands shake, and the heart is covered in scars. If you cherish this journey of loss yet unbreakable resilience that is Paul McCartney, please subscribe to the channel so we can keep walking together through stories that move the heart like this one. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we continue to honor the people who rose from the deepest wounds life can give.